The wind howled across the hills of Judea. The orange sky dissolved into the dark blue of the approaching night, and torch flames flickered in front of stone houses. As a young boy, Simon would watch his father, Maccabees, talk about the old days. The days when the people of Israel walked under the Lord's protection free, without having to bow to foreign kings. But now, freedom seemed like a distant fairy tale. Seleucid soldiers patrolled the streets, their armor reflecting the little light that remained on the horizon. These were hard times. Antiochus IV Epiphanes, the king of Syria, had decreed that Jewish customs should vanish. The temple had been desecrated. Priests were forced to sacrifice pigs on the sacred altar. Those who refused died, and no one seemed to have the strength to resist. No one. Until one man decided he wouldn't take the humiliation anymore. Be sure to subscribe to the channel for more exciting Bible stories and hit the notification bell so you don't miss a single video. If you're enjoying the content, a thanks donation is always appreciated. And if you want to support the channel even more, become a member for exclusive benefits. Maccabees wasn't a warrior. He had never picked up a sword to fight a war, but his heart burned with fury. So when a Seleucid officer arrived in the town of Modine and demanded that he bow down, offering pagan sacrifices, the old priest refused. He didn't just say no, he rose up. With a swift blow, he killed the traitor who was trying to subject the people to this humiliation. Chaos erupted. Screams mingled with the sound of feet running across the ground. That was the day everything changed. Maccabees and his sons fled to the mountains, and there, under the cold light of the stars, the revolt was born that would be etched in history. Simon watched everything in silence, not yet knowing that years later his father's act of courage would lead him on a journey that would test his faith, his strength, and his very soul. In the mountains, the cold cut like knives. The silence of the night was broken only by the crackling of firewood in the campfire and the distant sound of enemy horses' hooves. Simon tightened his cloak around his body and looked at his father, Maccabees, who was speaking softly with his brothers. There were 5 in all: John, Simon, Judas, Eleazar, and Jonathan. Each carried in his eyes the same flame, the same fury against the oppressors who had desecrated the temple and enslaved the people. But now, there was no more time for lamenting. The fight had already begun. In the first months, they were just a small band, fleeing from one hiding place to another, attacking unsuspecting soldiers, and disappearing before the enemy could react. But something began to change. Every time they resisted, more men joined them. Farmers, shepherds, priests. Men who had once been afraid now wielded swords and bows. And in the midst of it all, Judas, the third son, emerged as a natural leader. He was fearless, quick, and merciless in battle. That's how he earned a name that would span generations: Judas Maccabeus, the Hammer of Israel. Simon, for his part, watched everything carefully. He wasn't as fierce as Judas, nor as impetuous as Jonathan, but his mind worked like a map. He saw beyond the battle, beyond the immediate confrontations. He knew where to hide, when to advance, and more importantly, when to retreat. Little by little, he became the strategist of the revolt, the one who ensured that the fight wasn't just a succession of desperate blows, but a precise movement, like a well-sharpened blade. The Seleucids didn't take long to realize that this rebellion wouldn't be easily crushed. They sent increasingly large armies, armed to the teeth, to exterminate the Maccabees and all who dared to resist. Dust rose on the battlefield, mixing with the smell of blood and sweat. The Seleucids came with everything: spears glinting in the sun, shields raised like a living wall, the arrogance of those who had crushed countless rebellions before this one. But Antiochus IV Epiphanes' generals underestimated one thing. The Maccabees weren't just fighting for territory or power. They were fighting for their faith, their identity, for everything they had vowed never to abandon. And at their head, Judas Maccabeus was like a storm in human form. He knew the fields, the mountains, the hidden trails. While the Seleucids relied on their numbers, Judas used strategy, quick strikes, relentless ambushes, a game of patience and precision. They attacked at night, when the enemy soldiers let their guard down, and disappeared before they could organize a response. Each victory made the resistance grow. Each defeat of the Seleucids spread fear among their ranks. Simon was always there, by his brothers' sides. He wasn't the most impetuous, nor the fastest, but his presence was an anchor. While Judas set the battlefield ablaze with his fury, Simon planned escape routes, coordinated supplies, and ensured that every small victory served to strengthen the next. He was like an invisible but unbreakable foundation. The Seleucids decided it was time to crush the revolt once and for all. They sent Maccabees, a cruel and experienced commander, with an army that seemed like an avalanche of iron and fire. But the Maccabees had already learned to fight against much larger enemies, and in that decisive battle, Judas did the unthinkable. He directly faced the enemy force, leading his men into the biggest battle of their lives. The fate of Israel was decided that day, and the dust had barely begun to settle when everything changed. The ground trembled under the weight of the Seleucid troops. Maccabees' army advanced like a wave of darkness, thousands of armed soldiers ready to crush any resistance. Judas Maccabeus, alongside his warriors, looked at that sea of enemies without flinching. He wasn't a fool. He knew that they were outnumbered. He knew that this battle could be his last. But he also knew something that the Seleucids would never understand. A man who fights for gold may abandon his sword, but a man who fights for his faith never surrenders. The combat was fierce. The clash of swords cut through the air. The screams mingled with the sound of shields breaking. Judas attacked like a lion, felling enemy after enemy, always advancing even when blood soaked the ground. But the numerical difference was brutal. One by one, his men fell. The dust mixed with the red of the battlefield, and then, at the height of the fight, Judas fell. The hammer of Israel had fallen. The news ran like wildfire. The remaining warriors managed to escape to the mountains, but without Judas, the revolt seemed to have lost its soul. In Jerusalem, mourning took over. The people wept for their loss, while the Seleucids, believing that they had finally won, resumed control of Judea. What they didn't expect was that the blood of a Maccabee wouldn't be erased so easily. Jonathan, the youngest brother, took over the leadership. He wasn't like Judas. He didn't possess the same battle fury, but he was astute. He knew that, in addition to the sword, war was also won with words. He began to negotiate, to form alliances. Meanwhile, Simon watched. He saw beyond the agreements, beyond the tactics. He understood that the real enemy wasn't just the Seleucid military force, but time, politics, and the betrayals that lurked in the shadows. And then, when everything seemed headed for a lasting peace, a new blow fell on the Maccabees, and the fight took an even more dangerous turn. The dust of war still hung in the air when Jonathan took command. Seleucid soldiers marched through the cities, collecting tributes, reminding the people who was really in power. But there was something different. Jonathan didn't fight like Judas. He didn't just want to win battles, he wanted to ensure that his victory lasted. He began to approach the enemies, not with his sword drawn, but with promises and strategies. He knew how to wait, he knew how to listen. And little by little he gained ground. The Seleucids, immersed in their own internal disputes, ended up recognizing his leadership over Judea. Not because they wanted to, but because at that moment it seemed like the most convenient option. Simon watched everything. He understood the importance of Jonathan's agreements, but he also knew that alliances made with greedy men came at a price. And, as expected, that price arrived. The new Seleucid king, Tryphon, realized that Jonathan was too strong, too influential. He set an ambush, feigning a meeting of peace. Jonathan was captured and soon after murdered. The news spread like thunder in the middle of a storm. The revolt, which seemed to be finally gaining stability, now found itself without a leader once again. The enemies drew closer, smelling blood in the water, ready to deliver the final blow. But the story wasn't over yet. Simon, the oldest brother, the man who for years had fought in the shadows, finally rose. His face was no longer that of a young rebel. Time and war had carved into it the hard expression of a man who had seen brothers and friends fall. But unlike Judas, who set the battlefields ablaze, and Jonathan, who wove alliances, Simon had something that none of them possessed. He knew how to build something that would last. And that's how he took command of the revolt, but also of the hope of an entire people. Only the throne he had conquered was still surrounded by enemies. And among them, there was one who was closer than he imagined. The room was lit by flickering torches, casting long shadows on the stone walls. Simon sat in the center, his eyes fixed on the map spread out before him. Jerusalem was safe for now, but the threat never completely disappeared. He knew that peace wasn't a gift from the gods, but a delicate construction built on blood, sweat, and calculated decisions. The Seleucids still prowled like hungry wolves, but they were weakened. His brothers' battles had broken their dominance, and the civil war that consumed the Seleucid Empire was an unexpected gift. Simon took advantage of this opening. Instead of attacking blindly, he consolidated what they had already conquered. He fortified the cities, reinforced the defenses of the temple, and ensured that the people could breathe without fear. But war wasn't just made of swords and spears. It was also made of words, of the right alliances at the right moment. And then he did what no one expected. Simon didn't just resist the Seleucids, he forced them to recognize the independence of Judea. In 142 BC, a treaty was signed. For the first time in decades, there wasn't a foreign king imposing decrees on his people. Judea was free. But Simon wasn't naive. He knew that the real challenge wasn't conquering freedom, but maintaining it. While many celebrated, Simon kept his eyes open. Politics was a treacherous serpent, and the threat didn't always come from outside. He wasn't just fighting against foreign kings. Within his own house, ambition was growing in silence. Ptolemy, his own son-in-law, saw Simon's power as an obstacle. And a man who sees an obstacle in front of him always finds a way to remove it. The streets of Jerusalem were festive. Flags fluttered, children ran through the narrow alleys, and the elders raised their hands to the heavens in gratitude. The city, which had once been trampled by the Seleucid armies, now flourished under Simon's leadership. He wasn't just a warrior or a strategist, he was a builder. His rule brought something the people hadn't seen in a long time: stability. The temple, once desecrated, now shone again under the golden light of the twilight. The priests resumed their posts, the sacrifices were once again made in the correct way, and the law was restored. But Simon knew that restored walls and maintained customs didn't guarantee the future. The freedom they had won with so much blood still needed to be protected. That's why he fortified the cities, erected watchtowers, and expanded the armies. However, peace is never absolute. In the midst of prosperity, enemies still lurked. On the other side of the border, Antiochus VII, the new Seleucid king, watched Judea grow like a thorn in his domain. The Treaty of Independence that his predecessor had signed seemed like a shame to the crown, something he couldn't accept. But attacking Simon immediately wasn't an option. The Jewish leader was respected, feared, and his people were prepared. If Antiochus wanted to retake Judea, he would have to wait for the right moment. The problem was, he wasn't the only one who saw the opportunity. Ptolemy, Simon's son-in-law, saw that growing stability as an obstacle to his own plans. Gratitude wasn't enough for those who coveted more power. He needed to act. But treason can never be rushed. It's like poison dissolved in a goblet of wine, invisible until the last sip. And when Simon least expected it, the goblet was already served. Nights in the Jericho fortress were peaceful, bathed in the silvery glow of the moon and the gentle wind that blew from the fields. Simon sat at the table, surrounded by his sons and by those who claimed to be his allies. Wine filled the glasses and laughter echoed through the stone corridors. But that night, among the familiar faces, there was one that hid something dark. Ptolemy, the man who had married one of his daughters, raised his glass and smiled. He spoke gently, praised his father-in-law, extolling the greatness of Judea under his command. But his words were like a blade hidden under a silk cloak. For him, Simon had become an obstacle. The old warrior had already done too much, conquered too much. Now his time should come to an end. It was quick. In the middle of the banquet, when the glasses still shone under the light of the torches, Ptolemy's assassins struck. Blades tore through the night and blood stained the stone floor. Simon tried to react, but betrayal doesn't warn before it strikes. At his side, his sons also fell. The man who had liberated Judea, restored the temple, protected his people with iron and fire, was now surrounded by death within his own home. Ptolemy didn't stop there. He knew that killing Simon was just the beginning. The real prize was Jerusalem. If he could move quickly enough, he could take control of the city and proclaim himself ruler before anyone had time to react. But there was a problem. Simon didn't just have sons who fell beside him that night. He had an heir who still breathed. Hyrcanus received the news before the coup was completed. And unlike Ptolemy, he didn't need betrayal to fight. He took his sword, gathered his men, and rode toward Jerusalem. Treason had been launched, but the battle for Judea was far from over. The news spread like fire pushed by the wind. Simon Maccabee was dead. Murder, treason, a planned strike in the shadows by someone who had eaten at his table, who had sat beside him as family. The people of Jerusalem murmured in shock, but there was no time for mourning. The enemy was on its way. Ptolemy believed that his victory was already sealed. He already saw himself in command of Judea, sitting on the throne that Simon had left behind. But he didn't count on one thing: Hyrcanus. Simon's son didn't wait. Before the traitors could consolidate their coup, he acted. With steady hands and eyes of steel, he gathered his warriors and marched to face those who were trying to steal what his father had built. The clash was inevitable. Jerusalem wouldn't fall without a fight. The walls of the city, which had so often seen the blood of invaders and liberators, now witnessed another chapter in the history of the Maccabees. John wasn't just a son avenging his father. He was a leader protecting his people, ensuring that the flame his family had lit wouldn't be extinguished by a cowardly betrayal. But while John fought to restore order, a larger shadow approached. Antiochus VII, the Seleucid king, saw in the chaos of Judea the chance he had been waiting for. The Maccabees were divided, weakened by the loss of Simon. It was the perfect moment to crush once and for all the independence they had won. And so, while John prepared to face the traitor who murdered his father, another threat arose on the horizon. And this time, it wouldn't just be a battle for power, but for the very existence of Judea. The drums of war echoed again. The Seleucid king Antiochus VII marched with a powerful army, determined to recover Judea and crush the last vestiges of the Maccabean revolt. For him, it was simple. The Jews had become too strong, too independent. But he didn't count on the resistance he would encounter. Hyrcanus, still mourning his father, knew that he had no choice. His city, his people, everything was at stake. He gathered the faithful soldiers who remained, reinforced the walls, and prepared for a brutal siege. The Seleucids came like a storm. They surrounded Jerusalem, cut off supplies, waited for time to weaken the resistance. But the sons of Simon Maccabee didn't know the meaning of giving up. The battle was long, exhausting. Despair haunted the alleys of the besieged city, but John did what his father would do. He didn't bow his head. He fought not only with swords, but with strategy, patience, and diplomacy. When the right moment came, he negotiated an agreement with Antiochus VII, not a surrender, but a pact that allowed Judea to maintain some autonomy, as long as it agreed to pay tribute. It was a bitter victory, but a victory nonetheless. Judea would survive. The lineage of the Maccabees wouldn't just resist, but grow, giving rise to the Hasmonean dynasty, which would rule for years. The name of Simon Maccabee wouldn't be forgotten. He wasn't just a warrior or a ruler. He was a builder, a man who erected something that would last beyond his own life. Time passed, and the desert winds erased the traces of the battles that shaped Judea. The walls were rebuilt, the kings changed, the empires came and went. But the name of Simon Maccabee remained, not just as a warrior, nor just as a ruler, but as a symbol. He didn't wield the sword for personal glory. He didn't seek the throne out of ambition. Every step he took was to protect something greater than himself, his faith, his people, his land. Unlike Judas, who set the battlefields ablaze, or Jonathan, who walked among the traps of diplomacy, Simon built something that could withstand time. And that teaches us an ancient truth. Strength can conquer, but it's wisdom that sustains. He knew how to wait. He knew how to retreat when necessary. He knew how to see beyond the present moment. Even surrounded by enemies, even betrayed by those who should have been by his side, he didn't give up. And his story makes us think, how many times are we challenged? How many times do we feel surrounded, pressured by forces that seem greater than us? Simon teaches us that resistance isn't just fighting with our hands, but with our heart, with our mind, with the conviction that what we fight for is worth the sacrifice. But his journey also reminds us that every great deed attracts enemies, that victory never comes without a price. He won the freedom of his people but lost friends, brothers, even his own life, in a silent and cruel blow. And yet, his mission didn't die with him. Because a true leader doesn't build for himself. He builds for those who will come after. Today, his voice may not echo in the fields where he once fought, but his legacy lives on in every story we tell, in every battle fought for justice, in every step taken by those who refuse to bow before oppression. Simon Maccabee may have been just one man, but his story proves that when a man fights for something bigger than himself, his name never disappears. If you enjoyed the story of Simon Maccabee and want to continue following other stories of faith and overcoming, be sure to like this video and share it with those you love. And of course, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any new content. Together, let's explore more powerful lessons from the Bible.